In the 1970s, feminists drew an important distinction and created a new language for fruitful discussion. The distinction drew a line between sex and gender. Sex referred to the reproductive categories of male and female, and as such, it was a useful biological concept, applicable to humans, non-human animals, and plants. Gender, on the other hand, indicates the socially constructed roles, behaviors, and traits of male and female. Gender categories may correspond to sex categories, but they need not. This useful distinction and subsequent academic conversation were fuller realizations of Simone de Beauvoir's famous 1949 statement that one is not born a woman, one becomes one. This existential rejection of essentialism sought to break the oppressive tendencies of anybody who used the nature of woman as an excuse for mistreatment. A division of labor has resulted from this distinction. Sex has remained a productive topic, get that little pun, I don't know, for biologists, and biologists are generally interested in the genetic, developmental, chemical pathways of male-female dimorphism, whereas people in the social sciences and humanities have made gender, not sex, the subject of their work. In gender studies, we learn about the ways that men and women perform their respective roles. People of male sex can perform as female gender and vice versa by adopting modes of speech, dress, behavior, and even values. There is very little talk of innate instincts in gender studies. Beyond the performative theory of gender, many fans of psychoanalysis have connected gender to early developmental dynamics in the family. Evelyn Fox Keller famously argued that men are more detached, objective, and stereotypically scientific because their identity formation had to detach twice from the mother, whereas women only have to detach once. We all separate ourselves from mother and thereby attain an ego, a self. But as a boy, I must also detach again in an unconscious realization that I am not even the same kind of thing as my mother, in large part because I have this thing between my legs, and then I have to identify with the father and all that, straight Freud. Male identity on this view is alienated twice from the mother, producing more remote, distant human beings. Now, I don't know where Evelyn Fox Keller fits in current feminism, but in the 80s, this was a very hot argument, and she continues to get a lot of respect in philosophy of science circles. In addition to these theoretical approaches to gender, much of gender studies has also focused on the many ways that prejudice informs gender positions and relations. Gender is a politically and socially coerced category, and patriarchy is considered to be ever looming as a threat. Subsequently, issues of power are at the forefront of gender studies, and many theorists have applied the Marxian class struggle lens to the gender issues, substituting men for the bourgeoisie. In this division of labor between nature and nurture, psychology has found itself in the middle position. The life of the mind is sometimes considered the most autonomous domain, free of deterministic physical forces. According to this view, evolution stops at the neck. But on the other hand, recent brain science and genetics is giving us some impressive evidence that higher level thinking and behavior are products of biological causation. I think there's a lot of wisdom in the sort of new approaches the sort of new insights we're getting from biology. Testosterone, for example, tells us quite a bit about maleness or masculinity. The most extreme of this group, however, are the wildly popular evolutionary psychologists, probably the most famous of which is probably Steven Pinker. These folks add a Darwinian ingredient to their reductionism, and they try to usurp every aspect of the humanities and social sciences into their paradigm. For these scientists, most everything about us, including gender, is biologically determined. Some feminists have been eager to strike back at this sort of reductionism, but rather than holding the line on the sex-gender distinction, which I think is probably the smart move, and based on what I heard from Ames, that's a distinction she also agrees with. This other group, also quite popular now, have sought to go farther and deconstruct the sciences themselves, trying to bring biology itself under the umbrella of power discourse. Tired of defending themselves against the prejudices of previous nature proponents, more recent nurture proponents and performative proponents have tried to cast aspersions on science, arguing that it's just as constructed as social reality. From their own side, these deconstructionists have pursued a kind of reductionism, arguing that nothing is innate, no gender, no race, no sex, and nature itself is just a constructed reality by those in power. French philosopher Michel Foucault, he's sort of the father figure of this general position. was highly influential when he argued, quote, the notion of, Foucault wrote like the most boring book on sex ever imagined. I guess that's just my opinion. He wrote, quote, the notion of sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conducts, sensations, and pleasures, and it enabled one to make use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle, end quote. Following this approach, more recent theorists like Anne Fausto Sterling and Judith Butler have argued that even the biological categories of sex are just artificial inventions designed to keep women and intersexed peoples down. Biological categories and their instinctual tendencies are not fact, but politically driven fiction, according to this movement. Society decides which of us are males and which are females, pushing everyone into rigid binary categories. Now, I'm doubtful about this constructionist view, and I'm going to try to explain why. As far as I can tell, there are two main arguments that are usually offered in defense of this controversial thesis. One is epistemological, and the other is metaphysical. The idea of socially constructed sex categories is premised on a general skepticism about human knowledge. Since all knowledge comes through the senses, they argue, and sense data is always mediated by our perceptual equipment, then we can't have direct access to reality. Add to this the now classic postmodern view of language that words or signs are never fastened to their referent but hang suspended in the eternal fog of différance. This is sort of Derrida's famous position. And then complete the skeptical picture with references to Thomas Kuhn's paradigms, or conceptual frames that shape and filter our knowledge. And if you put all this together, you have the ingredients of a complete skepticism about scientific objectivity. And this is fairly strong. I think this is really the dominant paradigm now in the humanities and the social sciences.